This is the story of grand reversals, much like the story of Joseph. Last week I targeted one reversal on a small scale, the conflict between Mordecai and Haman. It's a story that shows God, tongue-in-cheek, smile playing on his lips, as he tries to reach even the arch-villain named Haman. Today we move to the dilemma confronting Queen Esther. And of course, the story is found in the book of Esther in the Old Testament. Brief review. Persia is the world power of that day. It's the first part of the 5th century BC. Xerxes is king of Persia, also known as Ahasuerus. He rules an empire that stretches from Eastern Europe down right across the Mediterranean, through Syria, Iraq, Iran, and right into the subcontinent of India, down through the whole region of Palestine, Middle East, and to North Africa, what we know as Egypt and Ethiopia. Imagine trying to bring that region of our world today under one consolidated reign. That was the territory of Persia. Esther was queen, the newest queen, the replacement queen. And she was Jewish. As with so many other conquered people, they had been brought to various regions of the empire by various conquerors in times past. Esther was a Jew. Mordecai was her cousin and guardian. Haman was top advisor in the court of the king, Xerxes. He hated Mordecai. That hatred and that dynamic was the focus of the message last week. He hated him all the more after the humiliation he endured. And his hatred now extended to all the Jewish people. Haman did not yet know of Esther's connection to Mordecai. Haman did not yet know that Esther herself, the queen, was Jewish. She had kept her identity a secret from all those outside of her circle. So Haman hated Mordecai, and he hated all of the Jewish people. And here's what he decided to do. I'll be reading from the New Living Translation today. And just for note for you, it replaces the Jewish months names with names more familiar to us. Use our calendars these days. So the message is taken today from the book of Esther, chapters 3 and 4, beginning in chapter 3, verse 7. Listen. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence. The lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7, nearly a year later. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There's a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live." Take a careful look at the rationale that Haman used to justify his position. His accusations. The Jewish people kept themselves separate. They had different laws from other people. And he accused them of refusing to obey the laws of the king. His belief, therefore, his conclusion was that they deserved to die. All the Jewish people. Were his accusations true? Were they all lawbreakers? Well, the only breaking of the king's laws in the story of Esther is the individual choices by Mordecai, who refused to bow to Haman when he entered or exited the king's courts. Now, if Haman had been satisfied to deal with Mordecai individually, he would have had good legal grounds to proceed. And it appears Mordecai was the only one guilty of breaking that law. The Bible makes no comment on Mordecai's morality and the stance that he chose. It just tells the story. So there's no record in the story of Jewish laws conflicting with Persian laws. For what could possibly be wrong with laws that refuse a person to murder or steal or lie or covet even? Now, I could understand Sabbath keeping as being a law that could conflict with other laws because it may interrupt commerce on the Sabbath day. And if you upset someone's commerce, if you mess with their bank book, you will often reap an extreme response. But Sabbath keeping laws don't even enter the story. So Haman's argument fails logically when he extends his hatred of Mordecai to hatred of his entire race. Oh, isn't that just how prejudice rises? How racial hatred is stirred up? It doesn't have to be logical. In fact, it never is. Accused of being lawbreakers and accused of keeping themselves separate. Well, when they had been deported, the Jewish people from the southern part of Israel, from Jerusalem and Judah, Nebuchadnezzar kept them together as a community. That was Nebuchadnezzar's way of dealing with conquered peoples. He deported them, but he kept them together as a community. And so they remained an identifiable community, even in Susa, in the days of Persia, who had conquered Babylon. The Jewish people of Susa were recognizable, separate. Is that a good reason for hatred? Well, you know the answer to that. Of course not. It's not a good reason for hatred. And yet differences among us so often do breed distrust, don't they? And distrust turns to prejudice, prejudice into outright hatred, and hatred, as Jesus said, tends to reap results and come out into the open in actions. And hatred of one person then is so easily extended to hatred of an entire community. Haman was a wealthy man. The money that he offered to the king's treasury was money intended to pay the cost of exterminating the Jewish people. And it was a sizable amount, as New Living Translation says, 10 bags of silver. A lot of money. So Haman approached King Xerxes with his accusations and with his offer, his pogrom.
If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury. The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit."
It was no cost to the king to permit such a massacre. What did it matter to him if there was one less people to govern? Especially if they were as troublesome as Haman said. And if you had advisors and chief counselors, you should listen to them, shouldn't you? It does all depend on what you listen to, doesn't it? What news channel we tune into.
So on April 17, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7 of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them.
A chilling decree. Aren't you glad you don't live in a world like that anymore? Oh, wait. We still live in such a world. We only have to read today's news to understand that such hatred and prejudice, such a will to hurt other people continues to thrive. As current as today's news.
A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples, so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion.
Apparently, the rest of the population of Susa did not share in Haman's hatred and his despisal of the Jewish people. How did these people become national enemy number one? The stage is now set. The wheels are in motion. We need to keep reading.
When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it.
Those who live in palaces don't often know what's going on in the real world outside. And that's not meant as any comment on any recent interviews with former royals. I'll continue with the story.
Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king, to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die, unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai.
Now we come to a key question that each one of us will have to answer at one time or another.
Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?
Who knows if perhaps you were made for such a time as this? What time is that? Whenever we are faced with a hard choice, knowing what is the right thing to do and finding the courage to do it. Finding the courage to say yes to God. It's not just any kind of a hard choice, but the kind of choice which would please God. Esther became queen after the previous queen Vashti fell from favor. Xerxes selected her above all others. She was apparently a beautiful woman. But would not all of the contestants have been beautiful, vying for opportunity to be queen of Persia? Well, last week I raised a question. I wonder how much God had to do with the choice of Esther. Could he have worked with a different choice? Mordecai's response to Esther's initial reluctance to become involved provides an answer. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, he said. Why did Mordecai say that? Well, because he believed it. He knew God, and he knew God's revealed word. He knew God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob about his descendants. He believed that God would preserve for himself a remnant of his people. He also knew there was no guarantee for any single individual or single community of people. At the very least, Esther and Mordecai and all of their relatives would die. But yes, God could have worked through a different choice. The question really is, what will we do with our responsibilities? Will we refuse because the risk is too great, the cost is too high? Well, here's Esther's response.
Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
If I must die, I must die. Or, if I perish, I perish. Mordecai had pointed out to her that if she refused to choose, that itself would be a choice, as it so often is. Certain death would follow. To risk her life intentionally to intervene on behalf of her people, well, that brought the likelihood of death, yes, but it carried just a spark of hope. 3 days Esther asked for her people to fast and pray. 3 days to prepare to risk her life by entering the throne room of the king uninvited. 3 days for God to show up with another plan, to show another way. Or 3 days to figure out what she was going to say if she lived to when she entered the courtroom of the king. For after all, that would only be the first step in the plan. What would she say then? What would she do? Each step of faith and obedience, you know, leads to another opportunity to take another step of faith and obedience. Will God help her? Well, we already know the answer, but in the story at that time, Esther did not know the answer. What will she say to the king? Well, tune in next week and we'll continue the story on that line, or just go ahead and read ahead. But what about our stories? What about our situations? What about where we are placed in our world today? In our families, in our communities, in our workspaces and schools and associations? What about us? Will we recognize when it is time to act, to risk it all and take a stand? The story of Esther leads to a violent, bloody conclusion. Many of you already know that. As New Testament followers of Jesus Christ, he has charted a different course for us. He has said things as like not returning evil for evil, turning the other cheek, taking up our cross and following him, following the path of self-denial, of self-sacrifice. And we should know that there is no place for any follower of Jesus to demand his or her rights. But when we are called to stand up for what is right, for what is just, not for our rights, then we must take a stand. Come what may, in Esther's words, if I perish, I perish. Well, how often in our lives do we arrive at such a significant crossroads? Did you know God often invites us, mortal human beings, to join us in accomplishing his work in this world? And every such invitation from God comes couched with the question, am I here for such a time as this? Now, positioning matters in so many athletic sports. I'm a hockey fan. Wayne Gretzky's dad always told him, don't go to where the puck is, go to where the puck will be. Some players handle the puck so much better than others in the game of hockey, and they can make plays. But the other skaters need to be in position to receive a pass. They need to be in position if the playmaker has any hope of success. How they play away from the puck so often determines the success of the team. A Christian lives a positional life. By God's design, he has his agents, his subjects, his children, where he wants us to be, ready to respond as opportunities arise. We get in position for the play God has in mind. For who knows? You may be just where God wants you to be in such a time as this. Every place we occupy is a place from which to serve God. Every privilege is a responsibility. Every gift is a stewardship. Every blessing is given by God and intended to be used to bless others. That is God's way for God's people. When privileges are jealously protected, when gifts are selfishly hoarded, we are missing God's way. Now, Esther was not in her role to enjoy privilege. She was there to carry out her responsibility. Mordecai reminded Esther that she would not escape with her life being Jewish, even though she was the queen of Persia, and she was. If she did nothing, she would die. If she tried to intervene, she might also die. But maybe not, and to her credit, Esther took the counsel. Now, we would usually choose to face a death in an uncertain, unknown future than confront an issue today where death may be more immediate. Granted. But for such a time as this, we usually think of someone in a position of great responsibility or in public office for whom that phrase applies, for such a time as this. And it does, but it fits every one of us also from time to time as we pass through this world. It fits us in our circles of existence, in our circles of influence, and opportunities that God has given to us for such a time as this. We have been placed in our family, placed in a certain birth order, placed alongside certain neighbors, granted certain favor, or, well, you fill in the blank with the blessings you have, the gifts God has given to you. He has given them to us for such a time as this. Well, what's the point of my message? The point is to be ready, to live our life in faith with wisdom, to be ready to respond to the challenges that God sends our way, to live our life ready to respond. Last week I drew our attention to the fact that God is at work all around us, mostly invisible. That is his chosen way in these days. His name does not even appear once in the 10 chapters of the book of Esther. But he is not absent, though invisible. He is working behind the scenes. He is prompting faith and obedience among his followers. And he is working his plans for deliverance, his plans for salvation. God is at work all around us. And he invites us to share in that work in the world in which we live. Are our choices really of such momentous consequence? Well, not often from our perspective. But we will seldom come to the place of making a big decision for God, to honor God with a risk-taking faith, if we haven't been accumulating faith experiences by nickel and dime. Let me say that again. We will seldom come to make the big decision to honor God with a risk-taking faith if we haven't been accumulating faith experiences by nickel and dime, or by loony and toony, if you wish. Oh, Billy Graham wrote, "Today we are told how to look young, stay trim, keep healthy, have a good image, think positively, make more money, have more friends." That's the message we receive today. And he wrote, all these indicate that we are trying desperately to cling to this present world. Then he quotes James, What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. He says the truth is, life is transitory. If we want to make the most of life, he wrote, we need to face the fact that it is going to end. Then he quotes his father-in-law, Dr. L. Nelson Bell. Only those who are prepared to die are really prepared to live. Billy Graham goes on to say, the uncertainty is not in the dying, it is in the living. It is in the preparation. May God grant to each of us clarity to see the way forward in faith. Amen.